So welcome to our September edition of the Dockside Chat. I know this is actually a real background. I'm not by the dock, mostly because the dock is hot. It's like 83 degrees out there and roasting. I thought of going down the dock, but it just was not comfortable, which means I guess I'm ready for winter. We're only a month away from moving to Fireside, hopefully. But glad to be here, joined with my co-moderator for all these times, Tom Gunderson, and we have special guests. Eric Hargan, the Honorable Eric Hargan, former Acting Secretary and Deputy Secretary of HHS, and also a frequent flyer returner talking about warp speed from last time. And Mike Finch, one of the co-founders of our valuation laboratory, going way back, and just a great scholar in general health policy. So today's topic, I think some people have seen it, is to talk about basically Minnesota's Academic Health Center at the Crossroads. I think we should put it out there that we are all speaking pretty much with our own opinions. We're not representing any particular agency. I know I'm a university professor, but I'm speaking as someone who's a health policy expert, independent person. And I think that goes for pretty much everybody that's here. We're going to be conducting this so that actually, since Secretary Hargan is only with us for a bit of time, we're going to be doing 20 minutes on the record and then 10 minutes off the record to make sure we can capture some of his thoughts. As always, everyone knows what on and off the record are, so just be cautious. And with that, I'm going to introduce, turn it over to Tom, and then maybe I'll give a little bit of background, Tom, and then we'll turn it from there. That's okay.
Sure. Thanks, Steve, and good to have everybody on. And thank you, faculty members, for joining into this panel, or not faculty, but panel members coming into the panel. The idea, and we'll get into this right now, the idea is the University of Minnesota is in a unique position and at a crossroads. A group has been put together by the governor to try and figure out what we do with the hospital system at the University of Minnesota, if anything. But something has to be done soon because we seem to be up in the air as to where the future lies. So with that, Steve, why don't you take it?
Okay, thanks, Tom. So just a little bit of context for some folks that don't know the whole history here. What makes Minnesota a little more unique than most hospital systems is that basically the hospital in the mid-1990s had its own financial difficulties, and essentially a independent hospital group, or basically Fairview Hospital, before it started acquiring other hospitals at the same time, it had Southdale, basically made a deal with the university to have it take ownership of the university hospital. And so it's unusual in the sense that if you look at other major academic health centers, University of Pennsylvania, Case Western, others, that is not typically what you would see. There have been financial stressors, but people work that out in different ways. Flash forward to now, I think people have seen there's been different things that have been proposed. There was, of course, the Sanford attempt of merger with Fairview and all the complications that would have occurred with that. And now we're in a situation now where essentially Fairview and the university are essentially looking at a separation, which raises the question, what can the university do as a standalone institution in that situation? And a little bit of background, if anyone's coming in from outside of Minnesota, understand that the university is not the only medical school in the state. There is the Mayo Clinic that actually has its medical school here as well. The Mayo Clinic's actual medical program spun out of the University of Minnesota several decades ago, but still it is obviously an independent medical school in terms of what it operates to do. But that's the situation that's in play. If anything, if there was an analogy to this, it would be maybe Johns Hopkins, University of Maryland Hospital, but never to the point where Maryland would say have been acquired by Bethesda Hospital System down in Washington, D.C. So with that, I want to turn it to Eric Hargan just to sort of give us a little bit of context as to what this is, and then we're going to turn to Mike Finch for even more context, and then Tom and I are going to pepper you with questions. Tom, yeah. Good, Tom? Go ahead, Eric.
So yes, give you a little bit of background. So my background outside of government is really as an M&A lawyer in the healthcare space. So this is a interesting topic about exactly what happens in affiliations between entities like this. You have a situation, again, as Steve mentioned, that is not completely common of the situation, and especially right now, where there might be a separation. However, in all contexts like this, looking at it from what I've been able to ascertain, the two parties could decide to the status quo. That always has to be on the table. So things could keep on going as they've gone, in spite of the fact that there have been these executive orders and all sorts of things about essentially reimagining Minnesota's system in the direction of the medical school that may end up looking remarkably like what they're doing now. And that's always something that people are a little, when you see sort of the fulcrums moving somewhat from a policy point of view or political, or you see a lot of things going on, you never know. Things could settle down exactly as they have been. Whether people think that's good or bad, that could end up being the place that you do. If you do not do that, and if in fact the two parties separate, whenever that happens, because it obviously may not happen soon, could happen years in the future, then you look at the situation of what does a university system like Minnesota's and the medical school do in a situation that they're in. And there are a lot of options out there. A lot of state university medical schools have gone very different ways. You look at some situations where, say, Nebraska would be an example of a university medical system that decided on a particular path for themselves. For example, they pretty much knew that as a smaller state that they were not going to necessarily be able to compete with larger medical schools in larger states. They chose an interesting path, which was to specialize in something like infectious disease, where they could establish a real national and world presence in a very specific area. And in fact, Nebraska has benefited tremendously from really using its resources to concentrate in many ways on an area that had really lain fallow outside of government or Department of Defense and other areas of research. There are other academic centers that specialize in infectious disease, but in terms of state university systems, they really went for it. And you look at what happened during the pandemic, Nebraska became a real center of the activity that took place from the evacuation of the Diamond Princess from Yokohama Bay all the way through. Nebraska had a very central role, which we can verify, having been Deputy Secretary at HHS in that year, in 2020 and into January 2021, that Nebraska really assumed their role as an infectious disease center had a great salience for them as an entire system. And so there are ways that state university systems can really decide either to go the route of we're going to serve the state in all of its multiplicity. And you look at the executive order and some of the documents that come out, that would seem to be one way that is being pointed. There are lots of things that have been indicated, everything from rural to health equity to a lot of different areas for Minnesota. But there are also ways that people could point themselves towards particular excellences within the system and reorient themselves, or take the opportunity of this inflection point in the potential separation to take a closer look at where they want the system to go.
Thanks, Eric. I'm going to turn to Mike for a second here, and then and turn back to Tom for comment, maybe. Mike, you have been the benefit of basically having met Carl Plato, who was actually the CEO when all of this occurred. You predate me in terms of my Minnesota experience by at least 2 decades, and put it bluntly, you were there in terms of the deliberations of where things are. So I guess from that lens and knowing why it was set the way it is, what might you suggest gently are the parameters, kind of what Eric was outlining about what's in the realm of the possible?
It's hard to say what's in the realm of the possible going forward, especially in this environment. Back when this all happened, the state was basically balkanized. Mayo really hadn't developed except across the south east and a little bit up the river, but not very far. Essentia wasn't Essentia back then. It was Duluth, and it had the Iron Range in that area. Mercy had the whole eastern side, which got bought by Sanford, and then the Twin Cities Health East had all of St. Paul basically. Alina had a small thing. Health Partners had ended up buying Ramsey County, which was a county hospital. You got Hennepin, which is still standalone. North was not a player back then like it is now. Health Partners wasn't a player like it is now. They were further concentrated. And now what you find is everybody has spread out. I mean, North is a great example. North is a big project with Blue Cross. Blue Cross owns half of their primary care, and their hospital's grown dramatically. Fairview took over Health East, which many people think that's probably a mistake. Alina and Health Partners have both, but everybody's working at the same populations now. It's not like the old days when this all started, when they went to Fairview, what was going to happen. And people used to ask me back then, who's going to be the partner for Fairview? And I said, well, there's two things. One is, if you ever knew Carl Platow and went in his office, there was a picture he had in his office of a gondola going back and forth across the river to the university. It was his plan from the beginning. And don't forget, Carl's the guy who invented the multi-hospital system to bring the university into Fairview. And I think Carl and Propinquity, how close it was, were two big things. But the other thing was, I always told people, look for the weakest player. That's who's going to join with the university. And Fairview at that time was the weakest player. Alina was growing, Health Partners was growing. Mayo was establishing itself in broader context. Essentia was really taking over part of that other side of the state. So the times are really different now. It's going to be interesting to see what they do. And it was interesting to see that they wanted to go to another hospital. University of Michigan in two years ago ended up needing to expand. And what they did is they went up and picked up Sparrow Health, which picked up the mid part of Michigan. And they brought them in rather than them going out. And if I remember correctly, it was our friends in Tennessee who were the first ones to basically sell their hospital.
Vanderbilt, yeah.
Vanderbilt to a private group. We didn't sell it per se, but we didn't make a great deal with it either. I mean, it was never really a true partnership. So in the end, I think there was a rush to do it. At that time, it was easier to find a partner. Going forward, I think it's going to be very difficult to figure out who's going to be the right partner in this area, especially given that they serve the same populations. I mean, there's one obvious answer, but we'll save that for off the record.
Yeah, I was about to say there are a lot of obvious. This is an incentive to stick around for the 10 minutes that are coming up in 5 minutes that are off the record. Tom, any initial thoughts as we're kind of hearing potential future, potential past at this stage?
Yeah, I'm all for potential paths. I'd like to change some of the things if that's possible. The going forward, getting into this, it takes, I think Minnesotans and the people who are making these decisions will have to focus on this. It's not, as I understand it right now, but it could change. It's not about the medical school. University of Minnesota is a land grant university, and it has done a yeoman's job of training our physicians, nurses, dentists, etc. The university claims, not sure how the numbers go here, but the university claims that 70% of the state's doctors are trained at the University of Minnesota. Well, that's an important thing that that Minnesotans are going to want to keep. On the other hand, running a medical school takes a certain skill set that isn't easy. Running a hospital, in my opinion, takes a different skill set, not a whole lot of overlap on that Venn diagram. And it may be running a hospital today different than what Mike was talking about in the early days. running a hospital today might be one of the more difficult management jobs out there. And to try and think how this is going to play out so that there's winners on both sides is going to be fun to watch. So the question then to Mike and Eric is, A, does my analysis of keep the medical school, figure out what to do with the hospital side work? And are there examples out there with shining star medical schools that don't have their own hospitals?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the interesting thing about that is that some of the most successful, rather than let's talk about where they acquire them, another question is, how does the medical school decide to where do they put their students? Do they put them all over the place? Do they put them in one single institution? You can talk to some people and they said, they'll say, it's been very successful for medical schools that concentrate their students in a single location, that location gets known as the academic medical facility for that place. I had someone recently, we were having a discussion about this, and they said, people talk about Harvard Medical School, but within the area, within sort of the field, people go, well, Harvard isn't quite up to Vanderbilt and Duke. And I said, really? Speaking as an old Harvard man, I'm like, hey, what do you mean? They said, well, no, he said, because they spread their students all over the place. They go to Mass General, they go to Brigham, they go to a zillion different hospitals. So there are no sort of achievements in the hospitals that are due to Harvard, whereas Vanderbilt and Duke concentrate their students in a single location. So that's known as the hospital for Duke, the hospital for Vanderbilt. So there's not a single location. That's one thing to consider as they move forward. Second, you talked about the balkanized nature of Minnesota health at the time, the ongoing and continuous waves of mergers in the hospital systems have been going on for a while. And it's going to be interesting to see. There is always a difficulty, lots of places are dealing with it, of deciding who your dance partner is going to be in a space like this, because the systems get bigger and bigger. And there are also strange opportunities. You may have seen that there were recently, Advocate Aurora was busy doing a deal with, Atrium in North Carolina. So there's a upper Midwest system, Wisconsin, Illinois, and so on, that's merging with a North Carolina system. It's not even the old case of we're just going to keep buying assets near our existing system, but it's also like people are looking for different things out of the alliances that they're making in this space. And it's not always geographic. So people need to start thinking outside the realm of this local market. That's another possibility, is start thinking about who is a partner for Minnesota that might have similarities to what's being faced, or healthy distinctions that could be someone doesn't even have to be here. That sounds like a strange thought, but there definitely are, as healthcare gets a little bit more national and there's much more expansion of systems, people are getting more and more used to that notion of not being geographically bound. I don't know that I dare say that and get out of Minnesota alive. I'm here right now. I don't want to.
That's why you're in an undisclosed location.
I don't want to disturb University of Minnesota people. I've talked here before. Steve says no longer, never again. But there is that possibility of making alliances that aren't even in the state. Again, I don't want to disturb anybody's nest here, but there's also that's something people have been looking at now, that with this wave of mergers, and people go, I don't know who I could talk to right now, so maybe I'll think about something even more different than I had thought.
Yeah, I mean that could very well be a play that as Fairview is going its own way, it could think that way too, because there's a question of where sort of a reversal of what Stanford tried to do to Fairview. The question is whether Fairview has the assets, the capabilities to do that. That's a pretty bold bet given their balance sheet. We are at 20 minutes and plus a few seconds, so I'm going to take us off the record. I hope people stay on, because this is where it gets kind of interesting.